The flow of information across different areas of the brain results in the production of language and speech. And when there is an interruption in this flow, it leads to aphasia. Now, though this is a very interesting topic, many of us find it very difficult to remember the different types of aphasias and what they mean. So today, let's just get down to understanding the concept of language production in aphasia so that we don't have to keep reading it again and again. To understand the concept of speech production or language production, I am going to take the help of this pretty little woman. Let's call her Miss X. So let's see how Miss X is going to help us understand language. So let's presume that Miss X is walking in a park with her friend. When she is walking in the park, she receives a lot of information from her surroundings. Now, this information may be in the form of visual stimuli. She might see a flower or some leaves, so she received visual stimuli. She may receive auditory stimuli in the form of birds chirping or her friend talking, or sensory stimuli like a breeze on her face. She might receive sensory stimuli, olfactory stimuli in the form of the smell of flowers, and gustatory stimuli if she's eating something. So she's receiving all of these different forms of sensory information from her surroundings. All of this information is received from her sensory organs and it is eventually conveyed to her brain. And after she has received all of this information, she then comes out with speech. Now, what am I trying to tell with this particular slide? Production of language, the production of speech, can be compared to a reflex pathway. What do I mean by that? Now, to produce speech, there is always an afferent limb in the form of information that we have received. The sensory stimuli that we have received forms the afferent limb. All of this information is transmitted to the processing center. In this case, the processing center is the brain. And in response to all of this information, we produce speech. So production of speech occurs in response to a stimulus. Now, it might just be our thinking process. It can be internal stimuli, it can be external stimuli, but speech is always produced in response to a stimulus, and that is why I'm comparing it to this reflex pathway. Now, the most important part of this reflex pathway in speech production is the processing center, which is nothing but the brain. Now, as we all know, the brain consists of 5 lobes, but for practical purposes, I will just be speaking about the 4 lobes that is visible on the exterior, which is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Now, for simplicity's sake, we can assign one major function to each of these lobes. Again, this is only for simplification because the actual functions is very complex. To make things simple, I will be assigning one function to each of these different lobes. Now, when we speak of the frontal lobe, it hosts the primary motor cortex, the supplementary motor cortex. Basically, the motor cortex is present within the frontal lobe. So the function of frontal lobe is mainly execution. It gives out commands from the brain, which is followed by different muscles within the body. So we will give the function of execution to the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe hosts the primary sensory cortex, that is Brodmann's area 312, and it receives sensory information, information from touch, pressure, sensation. So it receives all of these sensory information. So we can assign the role of sensation to parietal lobe. The occipital lobe hosts the visual cortex, that is area 17, Brodmann's area 17, and it receives visual information. So this is also a sensory cortex because it is receiving information from the exterior, that is visual information. The temporal lobe contains the Heschel's gyrus, or the primary auditory cortex, which is present in the superior surface of the temporal lobe, Brodmann's area 41, 42, and therefore let us just give the function of hearing to the temporal lobe. Now we have assigned different functions and we can see that 3 of the 4 lobes have a receptive function. They form sensory cortex because they are receiving different forms of sensation, while the frontal lobe alone is acting as the executor. It is executing, it is giving out commands from the brain. So this is one concept that we have to understand. The second concept that is important for understanding speech is the concept of cerebral dominance. Now we all know that one of the cerebral hemispheres is dominant in every human being. So 90% of the human population is right-handed, and greater than 99% of right-handed individuals are left hemisphere dominant. The remaining 10% of the population is left-handed, and even in left-handed individuals, 70% are left hemisphere dominant, 13% are right hemisphere dominant, and the rest of them are mixed. So why is this important? Why is the concept of cerebral dominance important? Now it is important for us to know which hemisphere is dominant in each individual because the dominant hemisphere hosts two of the major players in the production of language. That is the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area. Now if you can see the Wernicke's area corresponds to area 22 of the Brodmann's areas, and it is lying strategically at the center or the junction of the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Now if you can see, this is the central sulcus, this is the motor cortex, and this is the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. Lying within the inferior frontal gyrus is the Broca's area, which corresponds to Brodmann's area 44. So these two areas form the major players in production of language. Now another concept that is important to understand is that the Wernicke's and Broca's area lying within the dominant hemisphere, apart from receiving information from the different areas of the same hemisphere, also receive information from the opposite hemisphere through the corpus callosum. So if you can see that the Wernicke's and Broca's will eventually be receiving information from the whole body, because all of the information which is being received by different areas of the brain will eventually be transferred to the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area, which are lying within the dominant hemisphere, and that is why the dominant hemisphere is extremely important. So now that we know all of these concepts, we can go back to the story of Miss X and see how she can help us understand language production. Alright, so let's just say Miss X was walking in the park and she saw the sun. So this visual information gets transmitted to area 17 lying within the occipital lobe. So area 17 is the primary visual cortex. Now when Miss X sees the sun, area 17 perceives it as a yellow circle, a yellow bright circle. That is what area 17 perceives it as. So what does area 17 do with this information? It transmits this information to the association cortex, which is 18 and 19. Now the association cortex is some of the most underrated regions of the brain. They do some of the most advanced functions of the brain. So what exactly does 18 and 19 do? It receives this visual information from area 17 and then compares it with what it has already seen, compares it to memory, and it gives meaning to this circle, to this yellow circle. It says that yes, this is the sun, and it associates it with happy or sad memories, and it gives meaning to this picture that 17 has received. What happens to this visual information then? Now after this information has been processed by 18 and 19, it is then transmitted to our first big player, Mr. Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area has now received meaningful visual information from 17, 18 and 19. Now Miss X was walking with her friends, and let's just say her friend says, "What a beautiful day." Now this information that Miss X has received reaches the Heschel's gyrus, which is the primary auditory cortex. This information is also processed by the association areas and then eventually reaches our Wernicke's area. Now let's also presume that Miss X feels a cool breeze on her face and receives all of the sensory information, which is eventually transmitted to area 312, the primary sensory cortex. This information is also processed by the association areas and it finally reaches our Wernicke's area. Now if you see, the Wernicke's area is also a sort of association area. It has received information, processed information from the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, and the sensory cortex. Now after receiving all of this information, what exactly does the Wernicke's area do? So what the Wernicke's area does with all of this information is that apart from processing it, it also decides on the mode of action. It decides on what the final speech output is going to be. And after deciding on the course of action, it transmits this information to area 44 via the arcuate fibers. So what the Wernicke's area is doing is it acts like a general of an army. So if you compare this entire activity to an army, it acts as a general because it is deciding on what the course of action is going to be, and it then sends this command over to area 44, which is our Broca's area. So the next question is, it seems like the Wernicke's area has already done most of the work. What exactly does the Broca's area do? Now, the Broca's area acts like a captain, or you could also compare the Broca's area to an orchestrator. So what it does is, if you can see, the primary motor cortex lies right behind the Broca's area, and if you remember the motor homunculus, the area which represents the laryngeal and pharyngeal muscles and the tongue muscles, basically muscles which are involved in speech, is present somewhere over here, that is in the inferior part of the motor cortex, which is in close proximity to the Broca's area. Now what the Broca's area does is, it acts like a captain or an orchestrator, and it gives commands to different areas of the motor cortex, and this motor cortex then further gives commands which is transmitted via the corticospinal tract and eventually reaches the laryngeal and pharyngeal muscles and the tongue muscles, which results in speech. So the Broca's area is orchestrating the activity of different areas of the motor cortex. It acts like a captain or an orchestrator and carries out or gives commands to different areas. It is important to understand this because this is the function of Broca's, and the activity of Broca's and finally the motor cortex results in production of speech. And after this occurs, our Miss X comes out with, yes, it truly is a beautiful day. Now that we know how speech is produced, we can move on to understanding the different types of aphasia. So to begin with, we'll start off with Wernicke's aphasia. Now in Wernicke's aphasia, for whatever reason, be it trauma or a tumor or surgery or whatever it is, there is damage to the Wernicke's area. There is damage to the general, basically. Our general is impaired. So as we all know, the Wernicke's area is processing all the information from the surroundings. It is making sense of the information from the surrounding, and it is also deciding on what the final speech output should be. This is what our Wernicke's area does. So what happens when Wernicke's area is compromised? The person will still speak, and his speech will be fluent, effortless, and well articulated. Why? Because the Broca's area is still functional. The Broca's area can still orchestrate the activity of the motor cortex. The person can still speak, and in fact he can speak fluently, he can speak effortlessly, and his speech is well articulated because our Broca's or our orchestrator or our captain is still functioning well. In fact, the patient is pressed to speak. He feels like speaking excessively because he's not being given a command by the general, so he's just picking up on random stimuli and producing speech. So the speech is still being produced, the patient is pressed to speech. Now the speech in patients with Wernicke's aphasia has paraphasia and jargon speech. What do we mean by this? Now when a normal person produces speech and strings words together to produce a sentence, he uses verbs, he uses nouns, and he puts them together in a way that the sentence makes sense. Now in patients with Wernicke's aphasia, they kind of replace the normal words with similar sounding words or with new words which don't carry any meaning, and when put together the entire sentence does not make sense. Though it sounds fluent, it is well articulated, the sentence itself does not make sense, and it is hence called jargon speech. Now this sentence usually lacks verbs and nouns. Now as we all know, a sentence receives meaning with the use of verbs and nouns, and these patients usually do not use verbs and nouns, and hence their sentence does not make sense. There is lack of comprehension. So if you can see that when a patient receives sensory information from his surroundings and is aware of his surroundings, he makes sense of the information because of the Wernicke's area. He puts all of this information together and comprehends this information because of the Wernicke's area. So if the Wernicke's area is damaged, the person has lack of comprehension. He cannot understand what is happening in his surroundings, and so he just produces some speech according to whatever the Broca's area is making him produce. It doesn't make sense because it is not in response to the stimulus that he is receiving. What do I mean by that again? So for instance, if someone asks him a question, where are you from? So he has heard this, he can hear it definitely. This information is processed by the association center and it is going to the Wernicke's area, but since the Wernicke's area is not comprehending, he will not be responding to the question. Instead, he will just be making up some other sort of sentence which does not have any meaning and is not related to the question that was asked. So this is what patients with Wernicke's aphasia usually come out with. So next, going to Broca's aphasia. Now let's say the Wernicke's area is functioning just fine. The general is working just fine. He's given a command and there is no Broca's area present to receive this command. What happens? So the patient produces non-fluent dysarthric speech. There is no Broca's area to orchestrate the activity of the motor cortex. So there is no fluent speech production, there is dysarthric speech production. So he still makes sense of the sensory input from the surroundings and he does utter words. The words are high in content. He uses verbs, he uses nouns, but he cannot string them together in a fluent manner because the orchestrator or the captain is not functioning. So his speech is somewhat like a telegraphic agrammatic speech, just utters verbs and nouns, so we can still make sense of what he's saying. He is uttering the answers that we need to know, but he's just not able to come out with fluent speech. So because of this inability to produce speech, the patient is frustrated and agitated in comparison to the Wernicke's patient. Wernicke's patient just doesn't care. He doesn't know what's happening in his surroundings, so he is not frustrated, he's not agitated. The Broca's patient knows what's happening. He can comprehend, but he's not able to respond in the way that he wants to. So the patient will be frustrated and agitated. However, the prognosis in these patients is favorable. Now speaking of global aphasia. Now in global aphasia, the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area are both gone. This usually occurs in case of an MCA infarct, for instance, where both the circulation to both these areas is compromised. In this case, the patient has absent or reduced spontaneous speech. Repetition is also impaired. Now, it is possible to repeat words mainly because of the activity of the arcuate fibers, because of what the patient receives and is transmitted and the Broca's area is able to convey it. So the activity of the arcuate fibers is required to repeat sentences or words. Now since the MCA also supplies this entire region, even repetition will be impaired because the arcuate fibers are also affected. Reading is affected, writing is affected, because all of this also requires the activity of both of them, the Wernicke's as well as the Broca's area. Now coming to conduction aphasia. In case of conduction aphasia, what exactly happens? The Wernicke's area is absolutely fine. It has received information, it has comprehended it. And the Broca's area is also absolutely fine. It is all set to take the command from the Wernicke's and orchestrate the activity of the primary motor cortex. So what is really happening is that the connecting fibers, the arcuate fibers, are damaged. We have to understand that whenever there is conduction aphasia, a part of the arcuate fiber is damaged. The complete tract is not severed as such. So you have some command going to the Broca's area, but there is the complete command as such has not reached the Broca's area. So what exactly happens is that the patient has fluent halting speech. The Broca's area is still functioning, so there is fluency, but it is halting because it has not received the complete command from the general. There are word finding pauses, again because of the same reason, because the complete command has not been received. Repetition, however, is severely defective. Now the act of repetition requires the complete command to go from the Wernicke to the Broca's area, and since the arcuate fibers are damaged, the patient is not able to repeat. So repetition is severely defective in patients with conduction aphasia. Now in a patient who has, for instance, suffered from a cardiac arrest, let's say, the blood supply in the watershed regions is reduced, the perfusion is reduced, leading to sort of infarct in this particular area. If you can see, it's like a bucket handle pretty much. So this is the ACA territory, this is the MCA territory, this is the PCA territory. So between the vascular territories in the watershed regions, there is an infarct formation. So what exactly happens? If this occurs in the motor area, it's called transcortical motor aphasia. If it occurs in the sensory areas, it's called transcortical sensory aphasia. So in this case, our Wernicke's area is absolutely fine, the arcuate fibers are fine, and the Broca's area are fine. However, the output, alright, so the connections of these different areas is cut off because there is an intervening area of reduced perfusion. So what exactly happens in this patient? The Wernicke's area is fine, the Broca's area is fine, the arcuate fibers are fine. So Comprehension, as you can see, because there is some kind of disconnection over here, comprehension is impaired. Yes. Repetition is doing absolutely fine because the arcuate fibers, Broca's and the Wernicke's are fine, so repetition is fine. Broca's area is fine, but its connections are interrupted. So there is some sort of reduction in the fluency as well. So fluency is affected, comprehension is affected, but repetition is good. So repetition, in fact, is the only thing that is well preserved, to the extent that the patient has echolalia. He keeps repeating everything that is said to them. This is what happens in transcortical aphasia. All other language functions are disrupted, but echolalia is present in these patients. So these are the different types of aphasia. I hope this helped, and do let me know if there are any questions. Thank you.